Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Leodina Integrito from BSED English GP, and I'm one of the discussants for today in EL 114 Teaching and Assessment of Math Skills. And for today, my topic is all about spoken versus written language and spoken versus written communication. First, let's have speaking versus writing. When we learn to speak as children, it happens without any effort, and nobody sits down with a baby to teach them the rules of English grammar or whatever language they speak. And still, children who grow up in an English speaking environment learn to speak perfect, fluent English within the first few years of their life. You can compare learning to speak with learning how to walk. It's something that happens at a certain point in the development of any normal child. Not only do we not have to teach them how to do it, we probably couldn't stop them if we tried. Learning to read and write is very different for most people. It's not something that happens by itself. It has to be explicitly taught and consciously practiced over a period of time. It's more like tying your shoelaces, which most people can't figure out how to do on their own. Someone has to show them, and they need to make an effort to learn how to do it. All human communities use spoken language or sign language and deaf communities, but not all use writing. Many languages have no written form. For example, like the Karaha language, this is the indigenous language of the isolated Karaha people of Amazonas, Brazil, and another example is the other varieties of Chinese language, such as Shanghainese, where it has no standard written form and it rarely appears in writing. And this language is spoken by 14 million people in Shanghai. Spoken language was developed in our species much earlier than written language. We don't know exactly how long humans have been able to speak, but writing was only invented around 3500 before the Christian era, which has at least tens of thousands of years after speech first developed. Now let's move on to the next slide. So these are significant differences between spoken and written language. Spoken language is the primary form of language, and there's an important sense in which spoken language is primary at the same time. Written language is not just a direct graphic representation of spoken language. Both spoken and written language have their own separate characteristics, and there are significant differences between them. The same linguistic system is the basis for both spoken and written language, and in that sense, they are both forms of the same language. But they exploit different features of the system and have different properties. Now let us define what is written language. Language has greater social prestige in most societies rates used. It has greater official recognition in most cases when you need to communicate something important to an official institution or company, such as filing a tax return or applying for a job. You are expected to do so in writing, not just talk to someone. Written language also has greater legal force. Written contracts, for example, are perceived as having a greater validity than a spoken agreement, and Written language typically forms the standard for prestigious forms of spoken language, so that speaking correctly is taken to mean speaking in a way that is similar to how you would write. Spoken and written language come with their own advantages and disadvantages. Writing has the advantage of being permanent and visible, for a speech can only be perceived through hearing and it's gone as soon as it's been produced. Writing allows communication over long distances, which was impossible for speech until radios and telephones were invented. When you produce writing, we can plan what we are going to say and revise it as we can. I'm sure many of us have wished that was possible with spoken language too. When we say something, we get rid of it as soon as it's out of our mouth. At the other event of the communication, when someone's reading a piece of writing, they can take their time to process it, scan through it for the main points, and reread it as many times as they like. Being able to write things down means we can keep hold of information without having to keep it all in our memory. It also makes it easy to preserve information beyond the life of a single individual and to create enduring works of literature. Now let us move on with spoken language. On the other hand, spoken language is quicker to produce than written language. It's direct and interactive and allows for immediate feedback. This means that it is easy for communication partners to ask questions or to ask for clarification, and so it is easy to make sure that what you are saying has been properly understood. Speaking also allows us to use extra clues like intonation and body language to bring our message across. We know that this can be a problem in writing. For example, when someone's joking or being ironic online and people think they are being serious because they don't have these clues to help them figure it out the intended meaning. And this is one reason why emoticons, smiley faces, and so on have become so common in social media because it brings written language closer to spoken language by adding in some new kinds of non-linguistic cues. Speaking in a social activity which takes place between people in a social setting and helps integrate people into social groups. It is an everyday activity that everyone participates in, as opposed to writing, which depends on access to education and so in many societies is only accessible to a smaller meet. On the other hand, when we speak, we lack many of the means for clearly structuring our messages, which is what we can do when we write. We can use paragraph structure or punctuation capitalization, or other visual devices which help to clarify our message when we write, because the reader can go back and reread a piece of text if the structure wasn't clear the first time around. To sum it all up, here is a comparison of some typical features of speech versus writing. Speech is typically less explicit. We can leave more to be understood by the context, whereas writing is typically more explicit because there's less context to allow you to infer. There is understood meaning, and so we need to make the writing more explicit to make or to ensure that our readers understand that we want to separate spoken language that we want to separate. Spoken language has less clear sentence boundaries. When we speak, one sentence typically runs into the next, whereas written language has clear sentence boundaries and are indicated by punctuations. Speech typically has a looser and simpler structure as writing. Typically has a minute on, place, and integrated structure. Spoken language is typically more repetitive or, more repetitive rather and has more restricted vocabulary, whereas written language tends to be less repetitive and have a less restrictive vocabulary. In speaking, it is normal to have a certain degree of disfluency, meaning that we make errors as we speak and have to correct ourselves. Written language, on the other hand, typically shows fluency, at least in the final form, after we have been through a number of drafts. In speech, we have monitoring features such as hearing that we have said something we did not intend to say and going back in correcting ourselves, and these are not available in written language. Speech relies on interaction features such as immediate feedback, our question with clarifications, and so on, which we do not have in written language, as speech is typically associated with informal features, or as written language is associated with no formal features. On with spoken versus written communication. So here in verbal communication, words play a crucial role in the communication process. To transmit or to spread the message or to deliver the message, word is the most crucial part of delivering the message. Without words, you cannot really deliver your message. So when words are used in the process of communication, this is known as verbal communication. Verbal transfer of information can be performed orally or in written form. Oral communication is the oldest means of communication. It is not anything which has been started in the recent era. So, in here, the oral tradition of storytelling has dated back to various times in history, as what I mentioned earlier. And again, spoken communication or oral communication is the communication by word of mouth. It is the most commonly used medium for the exchange of information, and it involves gathering or disseminating information through spoken words. Whereas written communication, on the other hand, is a formal means of communication, wherein message is carefully drafted and formulated in written form, and it is kept as a source of reference for legal records. Now let's move on with spoken or oral communication. In spoken or oral communication, it is the process of conveying or receiving messages with the use of spoken words. This mode of communication is highly used across the world because of rapid transmission of information and prompt reply. In spoken or oral communication, it can either be in the form of direct conversation between two or more persons, like in face to face communication, lectures, meetings, seminars, group discussions, conferences, and etc. Or in in indirect conversation, for example, in the form of communication in which a medium is used for interchange of information, just like nowadays. When the pandemic has started, during lockdowns, we are all communicating with each other either through telephonic conversation, video calls, voice calls. In those kind of conversation, we call it, or it is known as oral communication, indirect and direct. Now let's move on with written communication. In written communication, the message is transmitted in written or printed form. It is the most reliable mode of communication because it has proof or storage as resource. It is highly preferred in the business world because of its prominent and sophisticated nature. The various channels of written communication are letters, emails, journals, magazines, newspapers, text messages, reports, and etc. These are a number of advantages of written communication, which are preparing the message in the future will be easy. Like if you want to refer to any kind of message in your future, or if you are paying for something and you want a proof and a receipt is something that will serve as a proof. You can use what you had paid for, or again when you want to refer to any kind of message in your future, or if you are paying for something and you want a proof and a receipt is something that will serve as a proof. You can see what you had paid for through that. So receipt is a kind of written communication and it is a tool that you can use for future use. Next, before transmitting the message, one can revise or rewrite it. In spoken communication, once that a word comes out of your mouth, it is out and you cannot change it. But in written communication, you can check or rewrite, and those are the advantages of written communication. Next, the chances of misinterpretation of messages are very low. The chances of misinterpretation or messages becomes lesser in written communication because the words are carefully chosen. Next, the communication is planned. Like when you are writing, someone you plan and organize it. Lastly, legal evidence is available due to the safekeeping of records. Now let's move on with the differences of spoken communication and written communication. So here are the four of the major differences between the two. Formal versus informal, synchronous versus asynchronous, recorded versus unrecorded, and the last one is privacy. First, let's have formal communication. We use formal communication when we are speaking with teachers, parents, adults, and sometimes friends when we are in public places. Formal communication can be in the form of letters, memos, classroom discussions, questions, discussions with school personnel, or traditional writing. Formal communication uses correct grammar and sentence structure. So in here, which sentence or situation is more formal? Abbreviations like TTYL, BRB, and LOL, or hello, how are you doing? Of course, the correct and more formal sentence is hello, how are you doing? Now let's move on with informal communication. So we use informal communication with friends. Informal communication does not have to have correct grammar, spelling, or sentence structure. Informal communication can be a text, chat, greeting, abbreviation, casual conversations, cards, or Slack. An example for this one is BRB. Okay, now which sentence situation is more informal? LOL or good morning, my name is Jim. Of course, the informal one is LOL because it is an abbreviation and slang. Now let's have synchronous versus asynchronous communication. We live in an era of constant digital communication. With the top of a button, we can share insights and collaborate with people all over the world. But there's a cost. We can easily get distracted and lose our focus. This is why quality communication requires intentionality. It helps to think about the distraction between synchronous and asynchronous tools. Synchronous communication happens in real time or in the moment. By contrast, asynchronous communication can happen over a longer period of time. Synchronous communication might be a video conference, a live chat, or a phone call, and asynchronous communication might be a pre recorded video, an audio message, or an email. Both synchronous and asynchronous communication have their distinct advantages and disadvantages. Synchronous communication is faster and more dynamic. It's great for active participation in interactive discussions. It tends to work well in smaller groups, but it can lead to frequent interruptions and distractions that get in the way of work. With asynchronous communication, there is no need to schedule, which means you can go at your own pace with fewer disruptions. Asynchronous works well when the internet connection is unstable or when participants are in different time zones. It also tends to allow for a permanent record of our communication. However, asynchronous communication doesn't work well when you need to address issues in the moment and it can feel less interactive. Some communication platforms blend together synchronous and asynchronous components. A walkie-talkie app lets you communicate in the moment, but listen later and even adjust the speed. A shared document has real-time edits, but the comments are asynchronous and there is a permanent record of all annotations. Video chats can occur in real time, but then recorded for replay replay later. This can help increase accessibility. Meanwhile, social media platforms often blend together live and recorded videos, chats, and updates. Both synchronous and asynchronous communication are necessary for collaborative work. This is why teams should think strategically about when to use both types of communication. They plan for collaborative projects, and educators should be intentional about on how they use both approaches to improve student collaboration as well. Now let's move on with recorded versus unrecorded. Written communication is generally archived and recorded for later retrieval, while spoken communication is generally not recorded. When we talk with friends, we do not tend to take notes or tape record our conversations. Instead, conversations tend to be ongoing and cataloged into our personal memories rather than recorded in an easily retrievable written format. On the other hand, it is quite easy to reference written works such as books, journals, magazines, newspapers, and electronic sources such as web pages and emails for long periods after the sender has written them. And lastly, privacy. For example, many people use email and texting informally, like spoken conversation, are an informal form of verbal communication. Because of this, they often expect that this operate and function like a spoken conversation. with the belief that it is a private conversation between the sender and the receiver. However, many people have gotten into trouble because of what they have spoken about others through email and text. While most of us have become accustomed to using technologies such as texting and instant messaging in ways that are similar to our spoken conversations, we must also consider the repercussions of using communication technologies in this fashion because they are often archived and not private. And that is it for my discussion for today. Thank you and have a great day ahead.